So we'll begin. Welcome to FD 75, Overcoming the South Korea-Japan Values Gap. This panel is being presented by the Korea Economic Institute. KEI is based in Washington, D.C. We're a part think tank, part educational outreach organization. Since 1982, our goal has been to promote mutual understanding between the United States and the Republic of Korea. We're not the biggest think tank in Washington, but we have the largest Korea department. You can find our content, events calendar, blog, podcast, tweets, and other content at keia.org. So I've been looking forward to this panel immensely because we have 5 knowledgeable and thoughtful experts who are wrestling with the same question. What is wrong with the Japanese-South Korean relationship? They answer the question in usefully different ways. And if you read the 5 papers, you'll have a very comprehensive view of the bilateral relationship between Japan and Korea. We'll hear the presentations first. I'll ask a few questions, then we'll open the floor for your questions. I'll just make one context remark, which is before Prime Minister Abe came to Washington, D.C. last, Japan commissioned the Pew Research Group do some public polling to find out what American attitudes were towards Asia. One of their findings was that only 9% of the American public approved of Prime Minister Abe's performance. 13% disapproved. 78% had never heard of him. So we all have some work to do to get the public informed. So we'll start. We have Audrey Wong, Scott Snyder, Kan Kimura, Brad Glosserman, and Gil Rosman. It's truly an all-star panel. So we'll begin with Audrey.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm just going to kick off the panel by presenting a brief comparison of Japanese and South Korean attitudes towards their alliance with the U.S., and I would argue that although both alliances are strong today, they're driven very much by different motivations and mechanisms. And so I'm going to look at both strategic and identity reasons behind that. And then this has, important implications for how each country situates the alliance with China, and as well as alliance management with the United States and within the U.S., Japan, Korea triangle. So first theme, I'm going to say that both countries frame their alliances first in response to local imminent threats. And so for Japan, in the past, it was kind of ambiguous, ambivalent, and kind of concerned about North Korean threat. But in the last few years, it's increasingly about countering China, and especially the Senkaku Island dispute. And this is also reinforced by this identity of strategic rivalry with China, which is, again, reinforced by periodic Chinese demonization of Japan. And for South Korea, both threat perceptions and national identity in the country is framed, if not driven, by the North Korean issue and the question of reunification. And so these differences are reflected in the scope of the alliance. You see Japan's much more regional, trying to do more, be proactive, and South Korea is more cautious. It defines its alliance as focusing on the North Korean and the Korean peninsula. And differences are also reflected in their attitude towards China. So first, if you just look at regional economic policy in the TPP and the AIIB, Japan sees its role as acting as a trustworthy U.S. ally. And so, we're going to join the TPP, and we're going to be, cautious of the AIIB. And they also see China using the AIIB as a kind of competition for leadership in the region, because Japan has its own Asian Development Bank. As for Korea, you see that it was pretty enthusiastic about joining the AIIB. It signed an FTA with China end of last year. And for South Korea, economic relations with China is also kind of important form of strategic competition with North Korea. But I just want to emphasize that I think South Korean engagement with China is still very much based on the premise of having a strong U.S. alliance. So you shouldn't see engagement with China as kind of bandwagoning with China or distancing from the United States. In fact, if you talk to South Korean officials, you see the alliance is kind of a way to increase bargaining leverage to show China that, the U.S. has its back, so, you can't really just kick us around. And also, South Korea wants to reassure Beijing that we're strengthening the alliance with the United States, but it's not, targeted at you, and it's not a zero-sum thing. And so definitely, I think South Korea, sees that China as a potential partner in resolving the North Korean issue. So this perceived need for Chinese cooperation has made South Korea much more wary of actions that might displease Beijing. And so I'm sure most of you know the missile defense system that the U.S. has been trying to talk with South Korea for many years. Seoul has been really wary of, engaging in that debate, at least publicly. But I mean, as you see, the recent North Korean tests, missile tests, nuclear tests have, I think, really decreased optimism in Seoul. And because they see like China's continually supporting North Korea and not really backing the South or helping the South constructively. And I think this has really pushed South Korea in recent years much closer to Washington. And in the last month or so, has basically changed its public position on the missile defense system. And, saying like, oh, we're going to talk with the U.S. about this now. And when this sparked like very harsh Chinese criticism, I think this is I think this has also triggered South Korean sensitivities about hegemonic interference, because South Korea always has this identity. It's very scared of being perceived as a weak state, shrimp among whales, being trapped between two greater powers. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the short to medium term. And for South Korea, I think there's this interesting tension between its kind of national identity and with its strategic realities. So South Korea in recent years has kind of articulated a middle power foreign policy ambition, and wants to have an alliance for the 21st century. And so this is interesting because you see South Korea trying to have like a global alliance. It wants to participate in the G20. Contribute to solving global finance problems or climate change and stuff like that. But you see it kind of refraining from having an active regional role. Like it doesn't want a U.S. alliance to be seen as a regional role, getting involved in Taiwan contingency and things like that. And so you kind of see this tension or contradiction between its middle power ambitions and what I call middle state realities. It's kind of trapped between two great powers. And so a lot of what it can do is still very much, I think, framed in terms of what the United States and China are interested in. And you can kind of see that play out over the years because various South Korean presidents have really kind of put forth a lot of multilateral proposals, trust politique, or, having sort of cooperation among all these Northeast Asian countries, but it's been really hard to get concrete traction or having substantial cooperation. And the second theme I want to touch on is this gap, I think, that is in both Japan and South Korea. This gap between kind of strategic priorities and kind of elite imperatives versus a kind of national identity at the public level. And so I think politicians or leaders have become much less kind of rosy-eyed regarding cooperation with China over time. And also, so I don't think that, there's going to be a widespread anti-American sentiment anytime soon in either country. I think the alliance has very much stabilized in the last few years. But at the same time, there's still a gap between what the elite wants to do and what the public is thinking. In Japan, obviously, there's a very pacifist identity among the public. Been very dissatisfied when Abe pushed through all these security reforms, tried to reinterpret the constitution and everything, and collective self-defense. So there were protests, there was decreased approval ratings. And also, in the last year or so, there's like this resurgence of base politics in Okinawa. With this, so you kind of see this really dissonance between the central government, Japan, and the local governments. And I guess it's that different political scientists have done research, and so some people think it's driven by like identity and norms in Okinawa. Others think that it's more like political economy. You can kind of buy over, or not buy over, but kind of appease or provide side payments to locals in Okinawa, and that kind of may help to improve alliance management in that sense. So that's an interesting question to think about. Turning to South Korea, the public, I think it's becoming increasingly positive views of the United States and of U.S. leadership. They're not really seeing China as a viable alternative to that. And also, if you look at various polls in recent years, they are seeing the alliance as necessary even after reunification. And at the same time, they're also kind of increasingly blaming China and sometimes the United States as well for a lack of progress in the North Korean issue. So I think in terms of strengthening the U.S.-ROK alliance, it's really important to have this continued alignment on the North Korean issue going forward. And definitely the biggest gap between the elite and public, especially in South Korea, is in relationship with Japan and the comfort women issue. So the recent pretty historic agreement, December last year, negotiations were driven very much top-down, right? It's driven by the foreign ministry, by the government. Didn't involve the civil society groups or the victims directly. And of course, this agreement was undertaken probably under significant U.S. pressure, kind of like you need better trilateral cooperation, so on. So I mean, you see, like historically, Japan and Korea had little imperative to really smooth over differences because be relatively stable and strong U.S. presence. You're not like pushed to really have to kind of solve your problems, history problems and everything. So perhaps, with this agreement now, Japan-China issues and South Korea-North Korea issues will become more salient in the future, as opposed to kind of getting stuck in the Japan-Korea dimension. But at the same time, I think it's still a very open question, because in South Korea you see considerable domestic unhappiness about like the way the agreement is carried out. And so again, this highlights this gap between strategic priorities and the kind of this national identity and historical legacies that are present at the individual level. Not to say there's no optimism for increased bilateral cooperation. I think the North Korea issue could be a good start. And so I'm just going to conclude briefly. I'm saying I think for both countries, this kind of interaction between identity and strategic realities is very interesting to see going forward. I think due to the recent external security pressures, North Korea and China and so on, I think there's increasing convergence of perhaps identity with threat perceptions. You see in both countries this kind of relook at how they should position themselves in the alliance and with respect to relations with China. In Japan, you kind of see how are you going to reconcile pacifism with the need to really respond to external security threats. And in South Korea, it's also very much in flux. China now is increasingly, it used to be seen as a good partner, important partner, but now it's increasingly seen as a barrier to reunification, an interfering hegemon, treating South Korea as a subordinate state as opposed to an active middle power that should be respected in its own right. And of course, China also has supported North Korea, rejected criticisms of human rights abuses. And so I think this is a very interesting turning point right now to see how Japan and South Korea kind of reconcile these tensions, both at the elite and the level of the public. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This is admirably concise. I can pass this down to Scott Snyder.
Okay, well, Audrey gave a great presentation. I'm not sure I really have that much to add here, because she made a lot of points that are, I think, also part of my presentation. Really glad that Gil asked Brad and I. Initially, I was glad that Gil asked Brad and I to join this. Brad and me to join this panel, because I thought, well, it's a great opportunity for us to highlight the work that we had done in our book that came out last year, the Japan-South Korea Identity Clash. But then I realized that essentially less than 1 year later, this ends up being an opportunity to critique our own content of our book. Did we get it right?
Yes.
And so
I disavow.
And so for me, it was an interesting challenge. For Brad, maybe less so, because I do think that there are ways that I would have written the chapter on South Korean identity differently based on the current circumstances than the way that it was written based on the situation as it existed actually 2 or 3 years ago when we were really writing. And the main difference is that when we conducted interviews and when we looked at polls and everything back, beginning of the Park Geun-hye administration, the main theme was Korean confidence, driven by the experience with modernization and democratization, tinged with vulnerability. But I think that over the course of the past 3 years, what we can say is maybe the confidence is kind of encased or wrapped in vulnerability, and that rising regional rivalries, the challenge of South Korea's stage of development, having to move from basically being a late modernizer to trying to find a way to innovate, and growing economic and political pressure from China, have all kind of highlighted, the question of what's next for South Korea. And then, if you look at Park Geun-hye's actual policies, I think that in each case, she is actually challenging some of the long-standing tenets of Korean identity that have really been fundamental to South Korea's national development and development of national image. The good news is that they are being contested in ways that draw on an additional positive image of middle power that Audrey also talked about. And so what I want to do is just to go through, the three themes I think that are being challenged. Anti-communism, anti-colonialism, that's the Korea-Japan relationship, and anti-sadaejui or anti-hegemony or abandoning the shrimp among whales kind of way of thinking in South Korea. And, the other aspect of this, I think, is about South Korea trying to redefine its situation in the middle from one that is purely defined by geography to one that is defined by a position as a node in a network. That, I think, is an attempt to redefine a spatial representation of Korean middleness. Now, on the unification narrative that Park has introduced, it's really, the old narrative was the competition for legitimacy between the two Koreas, which, goes all the way back to the Korean War. And I argue that actually what Park has tried to do is to reframe the way that unification is discussed in a way that presents an opportunity to overcome the threat competition. And she did that in part by calling Korean unification a bonanza. She's tried to redefine Korean unification as an achievement that will result in a completed identity, I think, rather than as a competition between the identities of South Korea and North Korea as eventual dominant leaders in a unified Korea. Now, I'll just make one additional point related to the unification narrative, because everybody thinks about Park Geun-hye's trust politique, which looks shattered now, but a lot of people, I think, initially didn't quite understand what trust politique was about. It sounded like it was about trying to establish trust between North and South Korea, but actually, if you look carefully at the way that she described trust politique, it was always a challenge to North Korea for North Korea to show itself as trustworthy. If not, then North Korea will face consequences. It was never the idea of some kind of mutual reciprocity and reaching out and building trust between the two. Anti-colonialism theme, that's really, the comfort women was the main issue, really as defined by the Korean court that Park Geun-hye kind of inherited as the main issue in relations with Japan, and it became, for Park, under Park, a litmus test for whether Japan could deal with history correctly, as she put it. And I think that Abe's emergence as her counterpart provided a big challenge and was initially a real setback, I think, for Park Geun-hye in terms of trying to achieve that objective. And so much of South Korean policy, I think, toward Japan really became about trying to fight against Japanese historical revisionism. The Comfort Woman deal, she got an apology in the name of the Prime Minister, and she got a pledge of direct compensation from the government, of compensation to the Comfort Woman, but she also said that this was a final and irreversible settlement, which means that for the government of Korea, the Comfort Woman issue would be over. So what's really interesting about that is that it basically means that Park is challenging the perpetual definition of the relationship with Japan as it had existed in anti-colonial terms, and saying, no, we have to also establish some space for normal relations with Japan. Interestingly, I think it is the one area for Park Geun-hye where pragmatism has won out over principle in the conduct of foreign policy. And then the third area that I deal with in the paper is really about the rise of China, ties with China, and the issues for South Korea of trying to avoid being dominated by China, or basically looking for ways to enhance South Korea's leverage in its regional context. And so, actually in her Asian Paradox article, she talks about wanting to calm Sino-U.S. tensions. There's a theme that comes up among Korean academics about a quote-unquote internal balancer role for Korea, which I think it remains to be defined exactly what that is, but that is one form of response. A second strain of Park's outreach to China was related to winning Chinese support for Korean unification. And we've seen over the course of the past few weeks how that particular effort has been challenged by China's initial response to the fourth North Korean nuclear test. And I think that the relationship with China is also about trying to find a way within the region of demonstrating Korea's role beyond just being an object for contestation within the region. That involves actually not only China, but also the relative positioning related to Korea between the U.S. and China. I agree with everything that Audrey had to say about the fact that the U.S.-Korea security partnership has actually evolved and become a platform and support for Korean engagement with China. The THAAD issue and the recent discussions of that, I think, underscore that South Korea's leverage derives from its alliance with the United States. But then South Korea has also sought flexibility in terms of economic engagement with AIIB. And then the last piece is really about the middle power idea. And this is complicated, I think, by the fact that the foreign ministry has fully embraced the idea of middle power, but actually the Park Geun-hye administration itself has embraced some concepts like NAPSI, the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, that use the idea of middle power, but they haven't necessarily embraced it fully. But really what I think is interesting about the middle power idea is it represents the first positive effort to try to define a Korean identity, both to the Korean people and more broadly of Korea as a constructive actor in the world. And so it provides still, I think, an antidote and a potential escape hatch, really, for South Korea in terms of trying to deal with some of the regional rivalries. Whether or not it can be successful remains to be seen. And so I'm left with this, picture of a contested identity over issues that had historically appeared to be dominant tropes in South Korean conceptions of identity. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Kang Kimura is going to try to use a newfangled technology called PowerPoint.
No.
We'll see if we can make it work.
Then.
You want to sit here? I can move down.
Yeah, thank you. Wait. It's gonna start. Oh. What's it? Wait. Oh, that, yes. Thank you. Thanks so much. My name is Kang Kimura from Kobe University, Japan. First thing, before starting my presentation, I have, maybe, yes, yeah. I see this is Chinese, no, Japanese. Anyway, I'm sorry. Before starting my presentation, I have to apologize one thing, because I changed the title of my presentation. Originally, I was asked to analyze the situation between Japan and South Korea. But as you see, that we have a huge development on the December 28th about on the agreement on the conformity issue. So here, I'd like to try to analyze the ongoing situation after the agreement. Okay, and but analyzing the situation after the agreement, of course, we have to check the basic point of the conformity issue, which is the most important issue between Japan and South Korea at this moment. If we look back the process of the development of this issue, we can see that we had 3 stages. At the first stage, until 1990s, although we knew the existence of the issues or existence of the victims, but it was, we didn't have, at the time, we didn't have the diplomatic problem, the dispute between the two governments. Because at the moment, before, exactly speaking, before January 21st, 1992, Japanese government, the South Korean government shared same understanding and interpretation on the 1965 treaty, with which we normalized the diplomatic relations. It means that South Korean and Japanese government both understood all of the issue regarding the past was finally and completely solved by the 1965. But this is the first step. But after the 1992, South Korean government changed the interpretation of the treaty and started to insist that conflict women issues and some other issues are not included in the agreement on the treaty in 1965. So we started a diplomatic battle between Japan and South Korea. So one of the key is how to adjust the interpretation on the treaty, which is the most important on the Japan and South Korean diplomatic relations. This is the basic one. But another thing that we have to say at the second stage was that even though we had a very deep diplomatic battle between two governments, the public sentiment, especially in Japan, was very good. Never hurt or never influenced by such kind of diplomatic battle between the two governments. And especially, at least in Japan, such a kind of very good sentiment to South Korea was a very important engine to try to improve the relations between Japan and South Korea. But unfortunately, after the visit of the former President Lee Myung-pak to Dr. Takeshima, the situation has collapsed. I'm going to show you some of the data. This is the data about the familiarity rates of the Japanese people to other countries. As you see, that the familiarity with Chinese are gradually going down, but the blue one or purple one, the Japanese people had kept the very good sentiment until 2012. But it dropped very dramatically. And the more important thing is that, in the process, we lost the mutual trust between two countries. Especially in Japan, after 2012, almost all the people answered that we couldn't trust the South Korean government behavior. And we also, Japanese people, not me, Japanese people start to think that South Koreans' behavior is something connected to the Chinese issues. So we are going to start to regard that South Korea and China is one block and a kind of enemy block. Anyway, so the second point to evaluate the situation about the conflict between Japan and South Korea with the impact of the public opinions. Because as a democratic nation, it is very hard for us to change the situation without support of the people. Okay, then what happened after? What happened after the agreement on the December 28th? Yes. By the agreement, the first point, interpretation on the 1965 treaty might have been adjusted, although it is not so clear, because it is regarded that South Korean government has given up the legal compensation against Japan. It means that the South Korean government went back to the original position before 1992. So it is very easy for us now, at least at the governmental level. Now we are seeing the new situation in which it is very hard for us to negotiate each other. Of course, the social situation is different. However, the level of mutual trust between two countries has not been improved almost at all after the agreement. I'm going to show you some data. Okay, this is the data from from the Korea Gallup. About their estimation about the apology, the level of apologies by Japanese government. And as you see that almost all the people, if you are interested about the data itself, please download my paper from the ISA website. Of course, as you see that almost all of the South Korean people didn't accept the Japanese government apologies. This is their subjective understanding, and this is one of the very big problem for us. But anyway, they have that kind of understanding. And this is the very tentative analysis, the data from the tentative analysis which was made by Kobe University student. It means that our student, anyway, which try to evaluate the understanding of the Japanese people. Yes. Do you think this is very interesting? They checked. They asked the Japanese people about which side will betray the agreement. And most of that, of course, the almost 16% people, answer that South Korea will betray the agreement. And even the people who like South Korea favorites, more than 40% answered that South Korea will betray the agreement. Here we can see that in Japan and in South Korea, we still have a very deep mutual distrust in two countries. But it doesn't mean that we don't have any good news. This is one of the very surprising data for us. We have regarded that the historical issues, especially the conflict issue, are very important in South Korea and very important in Japan. So if we expected, if they made or we made a bad agreement, we expected that it will affect the supporting rates or political basis of the political leaders. But it is not. It was not. Now we are seeing that this is the data from the one South Korean organization, and just after the agreement, so the supporting rate of the Park Geun-hye was dropped just 4%, but it recovered very soon. And today's level of the supporting rate to South Korean president is rather higher than the original position before the agreement. But why then? One of the explanation here it can be found here. Although the agreement was very popular and is very unpopular in South Korea, but the people who support the ruling party and the president answer, they agreed and they can accept the agreement. Because, like the United States, South Korea is now in the very split society. So it means that they support not anything, but almost all things if their president, who they are supporting, they are going to support. So as long as that the supporter of the ruling party or the supporter of the president support the agreement, the political basis of the president will not be collapsed. Of course, same kind of situation can be found in Japan, and one of the different things which is different from South Korea situation is that agreement is popular in Japan. So it is very natural for us to find the increasing of the supporting rate of Abe after the agreement. But it is not the result of the split of the society in Japan. This is not so good news. This is the data from the Asahi Tonga Report survey in the last May. And yes, it is not so surprising for us to see that more than 80% of the supporters of the LDP answer that they support the understanding of the Japanese government, which means that they don't want to pay any compensation to the conflict victims. But even the supporter of the DPJ, opposition party, and more surprisingly, even the supporter of the 62% of the supporter of the JCP, Communist Party, And even the 52% of the support of the social democratic answered they are supporting the Japanese government understanding. So it means that on the issue regarding on the historical one, Japanese public opinion is very firm and very critical against South Koreans. But if there's one thing we have to be afraid, it is the misspelling. Forget about my misspelling and my pronunciation. The reaction of the very nationalist people, because it is said that the Abe government is supported by such kind of nationalistic public opinions, and we understand that they are not welcoming the agreement, and they don't like to have any deal with South Korea about the Kohomo issue or other historical dispute. So we were afraid of the reactions of the national people. But the result is like this. Like people like Ikuhiko Hata, he is a very famous conservative historian, almost denying the tragedy of the Kohomo women victims. But even he answered on the TBS radio on January 5th. I'm frustrated with the agreement, but I believe that it must be a product after the very deep thinking of the Prime Minister. Also, the famous nationalistic columnist Yoshiko Sakurai also answered on the Fuji TV program. I have a frustration about the agreement, but I supported it because it is a big diplomatic win against South Korea of the Abe government. It means that they support the agreement because it was made by Abe. This is conclusion, tentative conclusion. So, we solved something about the interpretation about the treaty between Japan and South Korea by the agreement. But, still, in the two countries, we have very deep mutual mistrust. But at this moment, the agreement was supported or sustained by the very stable political basis of the two political leaders. I mean, Abe, Shinzo, and Park Geun-hye. Hence, so it means that as long as they are enjoying the very high popularity or supporting rate, our relation might be okay, in the meaning that the agreement will not be attacked by any other person inside of the supporters of the ruling party of the government. But we are not sure how long this situation will continue. Because as you see, the Park Geun-hye government, Park Geun-hye has a very unique career as a daughter of the very famous former president. And Abe is a champion of among the Japanese national politicians. But if we have another more liberal or another kind of the political leaders, they are going to start to attack the agreement. So we have to check. We have to observe. We have to continue to observe the situation, especially of the public opinion in Japan and South Korea. We shouldn't give up. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop here. Mutual, okay. Mutual trust. Okay. The mutual distrust, yes. Yeah. I'm never educated in the United States. Sorry.
Okay, that was interesting.
That was fun. 3 thank yous. First, KEI for making this panel possible and for bringing me down here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Second, thank you to Gil Rosman, who has been, first of all, for his work on national identity, which sets the bar for all of us, who has been a relentless criticizer, critiquer, whatever the appropriate word is, for reviewing our book manuscript, the manuscripts of this, and for essentially doing all the organizational lifting here. And third, a special, special thank you to Scott Snyder, my co-author, who has had to put up with me for far, far longer than any human being should that isn't married to me. And having to, as you will tell from the tone of this conversation, has had to struggle with me and to find common ground in the two of us as we've gone through and tackled these topics. So thank you, Scott. And now I will say that I, unlike Mr. Snyder, will not be disavowing the efforts of our research, and I urge you to buy our books for all sorts of reasons, not least of which is the college fund for my son, with which all the royalties go to support. That said, what I want to do really quickly, and hopefully very quickly, is sort of run through the ways that the topic, I think that the points that we make in the book continue to be valid today, focusing merely on Japan. And as I tried to sort of think about, what is the image and portrait of Japan that emerges from our book, I decided that I could reconcile all of my contradictions by just calling them paradoxes. And that seems to be intellectually respectable these days. So I would say that, the picture, the way that we should think of Japan is it's a society, and these are large, broad brushes, but I'm prepared to defend them all, even to people like Andrew and Zach, who probably know Japan as well as anyone in this audience or in this room. It is a risk-averse and a fundamentally conservative society, yet at the same time is one that is accepting of very high losses and high damage, which is very much a function of the last 2 decades, if you will, the lost decades. It's a very resilient society, and in some ways you can see that as a natural outgrowth of its risk aversion and conservatism, or you can see it in some ways as almost a challenge to it. Second, there is an acute sense of vulnerability and sensitivity to the outside world without falling into the trap of a shrimp among whales, but nonetheless, there is also, I think, increasingly an inward focus in Japan. And you can reconcile the two, but they don't seem to be natural partners. And third, I would say that there is great confusion and loss of confidence over certainly the last 2 decades since the collapse of the bubble, since 1991, and yet at the same time, great concern about status. And again, those aren't necessarily contradictory arguments, but nevertheless, one could argue or make the case that there is some reconciling to be done. In the paper itself, which I assume you've all read, there are 4 cases that or issues that I look at that have materialized since we wrote the book, and that I try to use the prism of identity to explain. The first, of course, is the collective self-defense debate, in which I would argue, I think rightly, is that the Japanese evolution has been largely evolutionary. It has been characterized by restraint and constraints. That if you look at the discussion about the security changes, and in other words, for those of you that aren't Japan scholars and you hear talk about great changes and a revolution and the remilitarization of Japan, that's nonsense. Flat out nonsense. We are seeing a very standard, I think, easily understandable trajectory that is completely consistent with Japanese history over the last 30, 40 years, in fact. You see this in the language. This is largely still cloaked in the language of pacifism, which, by the way, as I've thought about it, and I heard Audrey's comment, the only comment I would make is while we do call Japan pacifistic, it really isn't. I mean, in the sense that it believes in one nation defense historically, and the CSD debate changes that. But the fact of the matter is the Japanese aren't prepared to just roll over in the event of some sort of incursion on their sovereign rights and sovereign territory. So it probably isn't effectively accurate to use the word pacifism, but that seems to be the sort of common phraseology, and I think I fell into that trap rather reflexively myself. That if you look at the national security debate over the last couple of years, it has been a tug of war between those who seek to redefine Japanese secure identity and those who would seek to consolidate it. Obviously, the conservatives redefining, and I think the counterforces are those that are consolidating. And in fact, I would argue that the traditional notion of Japanese security and identity, pacifism that we call it incorrectly, has nevertheless anchored and restrained security policy. So it's created this frame. And I think it's kept Japan within that particular current and that channel. And so that the fact of if you look really about the discussion during the course of the parliamentary debate, it has largely been about the constraints. And that was where so much of the emphasis lies. So to me, that suggests that the existing national identity parameters within the security context are consistent and continue to hold. Second, about TPP was the second issue that I looked at, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I mean, if you look at the way that TPP is debated in Japan, there's the discussion of whether it's about being a rule maker versus a rule taker. I mean, there's the subterranean conversation about containing China and seeing this as a way of besting China in the regional competition. But I think more importantly, it's seen as a strategic instrument within Japan to bring about much needed economic and structural reform. And so the phrase is that you have a one-shot opportunity to use Gaiatsu to implement an unprecedented level of trade liberalization and the economic reforms promised by Prime Minister Abe. So that's the context in which I think we should think about TPP. On the other hand, you have the traditional constituencies that are opposed to it, primarily within the agricultural interest. Now, it's easy just to dismiss that as your conventional heavy-handed, sticky-fingered, cosseted, protected constituencies. I would argue, in fact, it's really tied again to a notion of identity. And there's a very interesting tension that emerges from that, which we discuss in the book, I think. I think it's in the book. It's not, it's in another book. And certainly in my paper. And the point, there's a former Minister of Agricultural, Fisheries, and Forestry who refers to TPP as a black ship, which for those, again, of you that know Japan, this is the iconic image of a foreign invader, one that seeks to change and transform the society as a whole. I think that's a powerful referent. I would also argue that TPP is a challenge to Japanese consumer-oriented society, and that that in the capitalist economic model, fragments communities, emphasizing acquisition that promotes inequality, and undermines the Japanese relationship with nature and the environment. Now, this is kind of touchy-feely, but I think this is a really, really powerful element of Japanese thinking about who they are and the way that they conceive of themselves and their place in the world. And this has, I think, consequences that extend far beyond TPP. And it's one that are easily dismissed because we either see it on one end as a far-right radicalism, this idealized notion of society that, in fact, many of the conservatives have. It's also, if you remember, or for those of you that are old enough to know, it is a very far-left trope, anti-capitalism. And so we see this on the fringes and tend to dismiss it. But I think if you look at so much of the survey data, what in fact you see is a very powerful identification among the Japanese toward the environment. So you put these together and it gives you, I think, a very important subterranean current that really is underappreciated within, I think, the assessment of Japanese thinking about society, about economic reform. And you see this manifesting in a lot of different ways. Suspicion of capitalism is powerfully, powerfully important in Japan, even though in theory, Japan Inc. has been so successful at it. And I would note to you, by the way, that there is a Yomiuri poll that came out yesterday that talks about constitutional reform. The second most important item for the people that believe in constitutional reform, above the security question, number 2 of salience, is environmental issues and the Japanese people's relationship to the environment. So I would just suggest that underscores the significance of that. Finally, within the context of TPP, I think there's a powerful tension between the need to promote economic efficiency, which is what is driving this notion of where we started, this idea of creating structural reform that unleashes the productive potential of the Japanese economy, and at the same time, this idealized notion of Japanese society that is manifested, number 1, in this notion relationship to the environment that I just mentioned, but equally powerfully has to do with women. Now, we can all talk about Womenomics, and it's a fun conversation, and I assume most of you are familiar with it. Nevertheless, the notion of unleashing the productive potential of women really runs smack into the wall of the conservative notion of where the woman's place belongs in Japan. And rightly or wrongly, nevertheless, there is powerful resistance to the idea that you get women out of the house, not taking care of the family, and getting into the workplace where they boost Japanese GDP by anywhere from 0.8 to 1.8%. That's a powerful contrast as well. Third point is the 70th anniversary speech that Prime Minister Abe made on August the 14th. I would just note, you can see in the speech all of the key tropes. Japan is an isolated nation that was buffeted by war and was responding to larger geopolitical forces, perilously close to a shrimp among whales, interestingly enough. Second, that there is this notion of Japan as being a victim in the war as well. And it starts with if you read the speech, Abe's discussion of victimization starts with Japan as a victim, not other victims. And only after that box has been checked does he happen to move on. And third, he underscores the status of Japan as a peaceful nation in the post-war era. And then we'll file those away. Fourth point, finally, the comfort women deal, which I think Kimura-san handled very well. I would note once again that this is actually one of the ideas that Scott and I put forward in the book. We're really pleased that the governments have accepted it. We are... One more reason to buy the book, because there's still a couple of more ideas to go, and I'm not going to tell you what they are, so buy the book. 2, there are interesting problems in the comfort women deal. Number 1, because the entire notion of this behavior that Japan is being understandably, I want to say chastised, but that's too glib, that Japan is being blamed for, really, if you think about it, at the very heart, challenges the narrative of Japan as a victim of the war itself. So acknowledging, in fact, that Japan did all these horrible things to all these women kind of shifts the perceptual gap. And so it's understandable at some level, and I would be careful how far I went with this, though, that there's understandable resistance to the notion of accepting that trope within Japanese society itself. Third, I think this notion, as has been mentioned, or maybe, that the ROK seeks to use these issues as a cudgel and to seize the moral high ground, the question of whether or not the issue will ever actually be settled, again, goes to this notion of Japan being buffeted by forces that are beyond its control. Once again, playing into the victim and to this sort of powerlessness trope. And finally, I would argue that Japan is being pinched between the twin pillars of pre-war powerlessness and post-war peacefulness, and that the comfort women deal just wrecks a huge wrecking ball through both of those. And so understanding the way of reconciling all of these and the damage that it does to the Japanese notion of who they are is fundamental. And that's why we're right, damn it, in the book. Scott, take it back. Finally, I would suggest that in dealing with this, there is a way to build the future. And I think Scott is right, that what the ROK has to do is appeal to Japan's best angels and the best parts, if you will, of the Japanese identity to make this comfort women deal stick in the future. But it will take work on the part of the Japanese. And this, to me, is where we get to, I think, some of the most interesting questions about the Japanese and Japanese foreign policy going forward. The danger, it seems to me at this moment, is if the failure of the South Koreans to abandon the traditional image of themselves as a victim means that we are at the risk of getting caught in a negative feedback loop in which the South Koreans victimize the Japanese become more recalcitrant, more hidebound, more reluctant to engage. And I would argue, and this is a very complicated thesis, and I doubt I'll be able to get to it here, but stay tuned. Japan right now is at the peak of its power. If you look at the structural nature of Japanese society, economy, Japan goes down from here. It just, take that as a given, I'm right, just accept that. If that is the case, Japan's leverage is maximized today. So what Japan has to do, the fundamental question for Japanese foreign policy going forward, is striking a better deal and creating a better relationship with Asia, which means ultimately striking a deal with China, and it needs South Korea on its side to maximize its leverage. So, in a sense, what Japan must do is revisit the Meiji decisions of 1868 and Datsu-A going out of Asia. That is where the key, fundamental question for Japanese, and I would argue Asian foreign policy is for the next 20, 30 years. Now, this does not have to come at the expense of the United States, and we in Americans should encourage a proper reconsideration and reconciliation. And we should not be threatened by this. But interestingly enough, I would argue that Japanese national identity can be used to build a more robust relationship with Asia, but it requires efforts by elites to advance and emphasize strands of identity that do so. And of course, the more natural tendency is to emphasize exclusivity and separateness. That's not going to work. The conservative leadership that aims to build Japan's national pride and confidence is less likely to prioritize the accommodative elements of national identity that facilitate relationship building with Asia. A Japanese leadership role, ironically enough, in Asia, which is the goal of the conservative nationalists and people like Abe, is best accomplished through engagement on mutually satisfactory terms, not single-minded realpolitik. In other words, identity can provide the answer. But it's not instinctive the way we get there. And it requires real work, and it's going to require fundamental challenges and reassessments of the way that countries assess who they are and how they relate to others. And Scott's right insofar as South Korea is beginning this process, but there's no guarantee where it goes, nor is there any guarantee of how the Japanese will respond and whether the Americans are prepared to support this process as it moves forward. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here on what I think is a very successful panel, and I hope I can do justice as the wrap-up person for it. This panel was stimulated by the book by Scott and Brad coming out about a year ago, and I thought, hey, this would be a really good theme to follow up on and to get them to update and reconsider and disavow if necessary their views, and to get some others who are working on these issues to reflect on these themes. And then we got the exciting development on December 28th, making the panel all the more interesting. This is one of 4 KEI panels. 2 will be in DC, and what I do is I write an introduction to each of them and edit the papers, and so there already is an introduction available that reflects on these papers and compares them to some degree. It will appear in the summer as part of this overall KEI book, but you can contact me directly if you want to see that. Okay, so what I see in every year when there's a KEI set of panels, one of the themes is a national identity. I think that's been underestimated in the international studies literature. And I've advanced the theme, a national identity gap. And if you think of the Cold War era, the national identity gap of greatest salience was the Sino-Soviet dispute. Impossible to explain that dispute without really delving into aspects of identity, including ideology. And I think if you go to the post-Cold War era, the post-the 1990 era, really this Japan-South Korea trouble is the most striking example of how identities have contradicted what one might expect to happen based on either realist thinking or liberal thinking. And so just the last few years have been the peak of this challenge, and that's why it's so interesting to look at identity gaps. Now, identity can be a more rigorous, well-defined term broken into many dimensions. I've been trying to do that, but I won't go into the various dimensions here. Instead, I'll say that my oral remarks will concentrate on what is the aftermath of the December 28th agreement. Where are we going? We've already had some comments about that, and I want to emphasize that. But first, I'll say just a little bit about how we got there. And in my mind, we got there primarily because of the United States and the security insistence. I think this is a big credit to the Obama administration, working intensely and continuously over 2 years to manage this difficult issue when Abe and Park were neither inclined to make the kinds of deals that were needed. And I think what brought this to the fore, among other things, were the history wars being conducted in Washington especially, where the Japanese and the Korean officials and spokespersons came to Washington to make their case and to say the other side was all wrong. And what they heard in Washington from their audiences, it was, why are you wasting our time? You know, we're not going to change the name of the Japan Sea to the East Sea, and we're not going to get deeply involved in this dispute. Yes, we get more and more involved, but to settle the dispute, not to take one side or the other in a major way. And so then we had the visits of Abe and Park to the United States last year, and both of them were constructive in moving this forward with lots of pressure from the Obama administration. The 70th anniversary speech met those essential minimal standards. The Abe Park meeting in early November in Beijing was helpful, and then we got December 28th. Okay, so what was the U.S. trying to do? It was trying to build, of course, a strategic triangle as an essential part of the rebalance to Asia. Without this, the rebalance looks pretty hollow. Many think it doesn't look very deep anyways, but the South China Sea and this were the two big security challenges. And the U.S. was blaming one side or the other. For a while, I think it blamed Abe more for not doing what was necessary to straighten up this relationship. And then clearly in the last 6 months or more, Park was getting the bulk of the pressure. And so I think she had to make the more difficult concessions, as we see from the results, where the South Korean public was unhappier. I think that was to be anticipated. She made the more difficult concessions. And I think the U.S. idea is to really see this relationship in the context of some globalization, sort of the new order that is being developed in Asia under U.S. leadership with close involvement of Japan and South Korea. And it's really globalization versus Sinocentrism. And so how do we get this forward? And so therefore you have to remove this identity barrier as well as the identity impact on strategic cooperation. So Japan, in seeing itself as a victim and making South Korea, I think, the most important victimizer over the last 2 or 3 years. When you look at Yomiuri Shimbun, I think that stands for the Abe administration. It stands for the mainstream in Japan that's been pushing the security agenda, the identity agenda. I really think that they have given South Korea an extraordinarily hard time in this period, and not appreciating the compromises that both sides would make, putting so much of the blame on South Korea. And they're the ones who treat South Korea as if it's like China, the honeymoon theme, as I see it, that Kimura-san was talking about. So, but there's a sense that Japan has been disrespected. And at least Abe has succeeded in refocusing the theme on, well, Japan can get past whatever problems it's had by putting the past beside it, by making certain compromises. Now, essentially, Abe has accepted the Kono thinking and reinforced the Obuchi Kim Dae-jung agreement of 1998. He's put them back on track. It didn't seem as if he would be willing to do that for a long time. But the bigger challenge is the greater focus on humiliation in South Korea, centered on Japan. And as the South Koreans have really tried to reduce identity as a theme in relation to China, and in some ways diminished it as a theme in relation to the United States, and as many South Koreans have found North Korea less and less an identity issue for them, then really Japan became the fallback identity theme. And there's this danger, if you don't have Japan as the boogeyman, what do you do to rebuild identity? So even though I think there are many dimensions of identity, and history is only a part of it, history has just taken on enormous importance. And I think it relates closely to a sense of cultural identity. In that respect, the Nihon Jinron theme in Japan from the 1980s has really not died down. There's this cultural identity of exclusiveness. And the Koreanness theme, even though many have been saying their civic identity has been overtaking Korean bloodlines, homogeneous identity, that has not gone nearly as far. So how do we build on this? Well, one of the ways is to refocus, and I think North Korea has helped immensely. So a week after this 1228 agreement, North Korea changed the subject. And suddenly it wasn't just North Korea, it was China, because of the way China really treated South Korea badly. They had a hotline that wasn't used. Phone calls were unanswered. China seemed to be blaming South Korea more than North Korea. And even though China has eventually changed course to a degree with the UN sanctions, I think this is a lasting impact in South Korea. So Japan is no longer so much the focus, and the Japanese in turn can separate China and South Korea much more. So one could go over the strains that exist right now, that in South Korea we have them saying, we don't trust the Japanese to really abide by this. Abe's a revisionist. He's going to come back with these revisionist themes. All the things we fear in Japan are going to come back. And the Japanese are saying they'll never remove that statue. We shouldn't pay first the $10 million, and then the statue won't go. The Koreans hate us so much that they aren't going to really change their hate. Look at how they're reacting to this agreement. So I agree that there hasn't been a lot of, direct acknowledgement of the situation. But I think that's the way it has to be for a while. Korea has an election in April. Nothing much can happen before then. Just don't do anything to arouse the progressives, who are the real voice that are going to use this issue. Japan has an election in July. Again, Japan can't do anything until July, otherwise it can arouse some groups. So I think the object now is just to hold a holding operation, and then Japan should pay that $10 million first to win, if Abe's strategic, to win over the Koreans, and then the ball really will be in the Korean court instead of the Japanese now insisting the ball already is in the Korean court. And then the issue is, how do we build a sense of shared identity, civic identity? And here I don't think the U.S. task is over. In fact, the U.S. has to shepherd this agreement through at each stage. It was really tough getting it to this point, and it better keep paying a lot of attention week by week. And Park and Abe both need to understand how upset the U.S. would be if either does anything to damage what is such a vital agreement as we are building closer strategic ties. So I think we need a new vision with an emphasis on shared national identity in the post-war era. We're not going to solve pre-1945. The Japanese right is ready to pounce. They never really accepted Abe's agreement. They accepted Abe, but not the agreement. And if Japan makes a deal with Russia and gives up 2 islands, as some think is possible this year, the right will pounce more and go on after both issues. The Korean progressives are ready to pounce too, more directly. So I think what we have to do is develop a U.S., Japan, South Korean community of shared identity, and that needs to be done not so much at the government level, but among elites, and not the old elites that were trying to solve the history problem, who are generally wedded to one position or another on history, but rather those who are interested in strategic relationship, those who are interested in the regional framework to go with possible TPP, those who really want to see the rebalance succeed. We've got to work much harder on this triangle. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Maybe we'll take the microphone back. Well, that was a set of fantastic presentations. To try to pull it together a little bit before I go to questions, I was probably doing the same thing you were doing during the presentations, which was to make a mental list of the push-together factors, what pushes South Korea and Japan together, and the pull-apart factors. What is it that separates them? You can almost make a matrix with push together, pull apart, and then strong and weak. And they give you some kind of mental idea of where the relationship is. So we heard on the push together factors, you have a common concern over North Korea. You have a need for stability in the region, maybe globally. You have preference for a rules-based trading system, even though, as Brad points out, there is some opposition to capitalism in Japan. You have a common desire to keep the U.S. engaged in the region. You've got maybe a common desire to moderate China's behavior, dealing with China's rise, if you posit continuing China rise. And last, you have the two sides together probably trying to figure out what to do about President Trump. They'll have a common interest in that. Then on the pull-apart factors, you have history, not just World War II, but the decades of Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula. You have the territorial disputes about the variously named rocks between South Korea and Japan. There are aspects of national identity which seems to discourage better relations. And maybe China, again, is a difference. Maybe the way they approach China leads to us pulling apart rather than pushing together. Unification of the peninsula, I put almost in a different box. I don't know. I'm not sure if unification is a push together or a pull apart. Depends how Japan deals with that issue when it comes. That could be a very fundamental moment in the relationship. My last comment is I used to have much clearer understanding of the Japan-Korea relationship until the Fukushima disaster in 2011. I was in Seoul at the time working, and I was very impressed by the strength of the Korean reaction to Fukushima. President Lee Myung-bak ordered all Korean ministries and agencies to provide unconditional support for Japan. No conditions, no reservations. He mobilized the government. And the private contributions of the Korean people to Japan after Fukushima were the highest in the world per capita. So that made me think maybe there's more to the Japan-Korea relationship than we think about when you start making our lists of pros and cons. Maybe there's something more there. Okay, I could ask questions all day long with this terrific group. I'm going to ask one question each so we can get to the audience. Brad.
Actually, before you do, I want to say, but you're aware that a month after the Fukushima disaster, the new textbooks came out.
I know.
And all of that generosity stopped literally to zero.
I know. I remember that too. Thank you. So my one question for Audrey Wong is that you talk about Japan and South Korea having different approaches towards China. That Japan's looking to counter Beijing, where South Korea is looking for cooperation on dealing with North Korea and with unification. And then you mentioned that maybe for Seoul, relations with Beijing and Washington are not zero-sum. They can have good relations with both. Is that true of Japan too? Does Tokyo see relations between Tokyo and Beijing and Washington as being zero-sum, or can they have both good relations?
Oh, answer now.
If you don't mind, we'll do one at a time.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't think like Japan is inherently against having good relations with both China and the U.S. Probably it's just more cautious than as compared to South Korea because there's just like this historical legacies and rivalry and everything. So I think it's definitely more cautious and wary of what like Chinese intentions are. But I think if China does respond positively, and I think Japan would be willing to engage with China. Obviously, I mean if things come up like the island disputes and everything, that's going to like constrain kind of the negotiations or bargaining and talks and everything. But so I think, I mean, look from the outside, it seems like Japan. I think Japan also doesn't want like perhaps China and the United States to get too close. Cause, I mean, past fears of Japan passing and everything. So what it wants is U.S. solidly on its side, and then together have better relations with China.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. My question for Scott is, if history is the biggest pull-apart factor between Korea and Japan, what's the biggest push-together factor? Is there anything the U.S. could do to help move that along?
I've been sitting here wondering whether the Trump factor might actually be the one that pushes Japan and South Korea together. I think that it really ends up being the question of, essentially, to go back to our book, can Japan and South Korea find a way to reframe their respective identities in ways that have greater commonalities? I think that has immense potential, immense value in unlocking the potential for a new relationship between Japan and South Korea.
And for Kimura, I was very struck by your notion that the history problem hasn't always been there. I think we tend to think of it as being always a factor in a relationship. You talk about emerging in the 1990s. So if that's the case, if it can arise, can it be kind of put back down? Are there any actors in South Korea or Japan, government or media or us, that have the ability to defuse the historic tensions?
Wow. It is tough questions, and really, if I have an idea, I will ask our government to do something. Anyway, the one thing I want to say is my answer, is political leaders now, because now they are enjoying, especially the Prime Minister Abes, enjoying the very stable popularity in Japan. This is a very rare case, but maybe the first case after the Koizumi government. So in that meaning that now it was almost impossible at the time of Noda government or Kannauto or DPJ government or even at the time ASO or some other government. So one of the things is our mistrust was our trust was destroyed in the very long process of the history of the dispute. Okay, so it is not easy for us to recover the situation. If there is something we can do, we have to show that we can do something, actually. So if we can, do that, we can do and contribute something about co-homeland issues, keeping the agreement in 2 years. In Japan, maybe we have another 2 years, because Abe will win the upper house election July, and I think no doubt. And I don't know how long the Park-geun can keep her popularities, but anyway, Park-geun government is also one of the very stable government in South Korea. So, as Jiro mentions, if we quickly start something about the agreement and can show something very honest to the Japanese and the South Korean people, so we may be able to change the situation, maybe very slowly, but steadily. said in that meaning that the political leaders are key at this moment, not media, not scholars. Yeah.
For Brad, there's a criticism you hear that Japan's foreign policy, is selfish and parochial. That Japan's foreign policy is really just about its own territories and about the issue of the abductees, the Japanese who are abducted by North Koreans. Is that a fair criticism? And would a bigger vision for Japanese foreign policy, if they could move to it, be a good thing for Korean-Japanese relations?
It's a frequently heard criticism. I'm trying to see who I want to irritate most with this answer. There is a default scenario which tends to, I think, collapse into a far more uchimuki, inward-looking sort of perspective. And so I think it's difficult for the Japanese to get past the abductees issue because, again, it fits the victimization trope. In terms of dealing with North Korea, that's a lot easier. And frankly, also in response to Kimura-san's question that you asked him, I mean, it's easier for leaders to mobilize political support on those issues that immediately attract them. So the answer to your question is that if you look at what Abe is doing, he's really engaging in a global diplomacy. His outreach to Southeast Asia is remarkable. He's gone to 49 countries in his tenure. He has been unbelievably peripatetic. He's reached out to NATO. He is, there's talk of pushing again the UN Security Council seat position, the permanent seat. So, I mean, there is an ambition. It's tied to a larger sense of status. I am, frankly, doubtful that Japan has the resources to sustain that drive over time. But clearly, the problem is it's more difficult to mobilize what is, I think, ultimately a population that likes the idea of embracing these larger issues, but it ultimately is more comfortable sort of not. I mean, this is a larger social criticism that I'm making in another work, and it would take, I think, too long to explain, but again, accept it as a given. And so the argument becomes, yes, the Japanese could do that, but it goes against their impulses, their reflexes, and it's really hard.
Mike is getting a workout. Okay, for Gil Rosman, in your paper, you talk about Japan and Korea clinging to symbols of the past, and that there's a need for new aspects for a shared identity for the future. You mentioned that for Japan, there's a search for pride in the past that's driving Japan. And for Korea, you talk about unification as being an enabling factor for South Korea. My question is unification of South Korea a future-looking shared identity type project, or is unification something that's more a past agenda that gets in the way of the relationship?
For Korea, I think that in the year 2015, there was the term bonanza was popular, the discussion of reunification intensified, talk about creating a regional system under what was called NAPSI, the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative. There was the honeymoon with China. There were all kinds of dreams, really, illusions as to what Korea could do. We were just talking about Abe's notions of how he could build Japan's status. And I think all of these status-building wishes get in the way of trying to constructively deal with what is possible, what is within reach. And they have a tendency to lead to a letdown, to cause a backlash. So I think one of the problems right now in Korea is the loss of their dreams. Suddenly, they've lost hope for China. Trust politique is dead. Nobody's talking about the Northeast Asian Peace and Cooperation Initiative. Even reunification with trust politique has fallen drastically. So raising these themes has the potential of being counterproductive. So I would say let's get to themes that aren't so centered on how your own status can rise, because right now so many are aspiring to statuses they can't achieve, including some of the U.S. rhetoric in the presidential campaign that exaggerate what the U.S. can accomplish. We're all facing globalization that keeps us down, and we deal with a very chaotic, messy world that's not going to get easier. So I would say for Japan and Korea, there are elements of the past they can draw on. They can look back a few decades and try to see more constructive developments, but I would hope that it's the U.S., Japan, and Korea trying to build on the notion of a rule-based Asian community with freedom of navigation and other overall principles to guide the transformation of China and others. That can be the foundation of this new development.
Before I turn to the audience for questions, I should give the panelists an opportunity to comment on things they heard that they thought were interesting or questions they'd like to ask each other. So, do any of the panelists have comments for each other before we open it up? Please.
Yeah. The one comment is about, this is out of my focus of my argument, but although some people mentioned about the role of the United States on the relationship between Japan and South Korea, but at the same time that you have to understand, our national sentiment is also very nervous against the United States. As you're seeing that in South Korea now, there's some influential politician, even the biggest newspaper, Chosun Ilbo, is insisting that they can have their own nuclear weapons. Of course, I don't think that they can do that, but of course, it is a very clear product of the frustration after the pressure from the United States about the agreement. And also China was the same. So, so I think that this is the kind of policy suggestions, but I'm not so happy to hear that the American scholars and American government loudly speaking about their contribution about the agreement. If they do so, the agreement will be collapsed. Please understand, even in Japan, there's some kind of the nationalist people, including the people who I introduced, like Hata or Sakurai, who they originally had a very anti-American sentiment and isolation type of the nationalism. And now the Prime Minister Abe is on the balance of the two types of nationalists, pro-American type and anti-American type. Okay, and now he is succeeding the control, and now the pro-American or more, compromise time of the nationalists is going to have the hegemony in the government. But if the United States, speak a lot too much about their contribution, this balance will collapse. This is this is my comment.
Can I just add to that? Number one, interestingly enough, Scott and I make this point in the book, and I think it's one of the interesting things that's, I think, potentially most controversial and yet almost universally unremarked, which makes me think that people don't read the whole thing. We call on the United States to play a more forward-leaning role, but not in the context necessarily of knocking heads, which I think it's clearly, if the record shows, that's what it's done, but in more of terms of setting an example. The problem with Gil's argument, again, and as much as I agree with it, is we've discovered in the work that we've done in other contexts that the more the United States pushes the two countries together, simultaneously, the more Seoul and Tokyo feel as though they don't necessarily have to do the heavy lifting themselves. In other words, there is a belief that we've found in both capitals that in the event of a crisis, the U.S. will force the other side to get in line. The Americans will force the Japanese to cooperate on the peninsula, and the Americans will force the Koreans to do whatever they can in the Japan-related contingency, thus reducing the need for those two countries to actually build a solid relationship themselves. So there's a bit of a tightrope here, and it's an interesting paradox, but one that I think is unfortunately very real.
No, it's fine.
Okay, I think Audrey made that same point, that the U.S. creates kind of a safe zone for South Korea and Japan to continue to disagree. All right, you've been very patient. I appreciate that. Let's take some questions. Yes, sir.
Just I want to make, my name is Yang Moku, professor at Norwich University. Actually, I want to make some comment on the South Korea, Japan deal over conflict issue. Just I believe or I feel that, especially from the South Korean perspective, all three governments made fateful mistakes. First of all, as we talk about, like South Korean government excluded former conflict victims and they're supporting civil organizations. So a lot of Korean people got shocked at the scene that deal without incorporating the victim side. So secondly, for Japanese government, I think I feel many South Korean people believe that Japanese government failed to give kind of truthful apologies toward South Korean government or people, because even though a provision of just the governmental direct fund to former conflict victims, but still legal issues were even after the prime minister's just a policy toward President Park Geun-hye, but in the diet, just he declined giving a direct policy on his own in his own words to Japanese politicians. So I think, generally speaking, Japan failed to give truthful, heartfelt apology to South Korean people. Lastly, as the professor talked about, American government made a fatal mistake as well, because in short term, that kind of pressure plays some role in pushing those two countries like South Korea and Japan to be close. So just the American government can achieve the goal to strengthen the U.S., ROK, Japan security triangle to check and balance China. But definitely after North Korean issue becomes suited, this issue will re-emerge in South Korean civil society. South Korean civil organizations, South Korean public, cannot accept this deal as it is. So definitely that Korean public anger over that American pressure, can become a boomerang effect. So it can just play a key role in hindering the strengthening of U.S., ROK, Japan security triangle in the long-term perspective. So my comment is just that agreement was fatal mistakes made by the three governments. So what do you think of that?
Do we have a reaction to that comment? Or, okay.
You go first.
There's every reason to think that the South Korean public is demanding something more from Japan, including legal recognition. And there's zero reason to think that Japan will ever give this legal recognition. So essentially what you're saying is this dispute has to live on. South Korea has been humiliated, has a just cause, keep going. And the United States is saying, if this goes on this way, we're in big trouble strategically versus China, versus North Korea. The rebalance is in trouble. The United States didn't act for a long, long time and finally did act. And therefore, if the U.S. has failed because it acted and it pressured, I agree that the U.S. should not go around claiming that. I claim that the U.S. did that, but I don't hear U.S. officials taking any kind of victory lap, doing anything with that. I think they've handled it quietly and very well. But if you're saying that the U.S. shouldn't have done this, you're essentially saying give up. And I can't accept that.
On the Korean government's dilemma, I do think that they were really caught between a rock and a hard place. And they made a decision, basically to try to send a signal to the government of Japan that Korean grievance is not insatiable. And they also realized that the legal aspects of the relationship weren't going to be reopened. So, there was a cost, I think, for the South Korean government to decide to cut this deal at the expense of the comfort women, but it's also, embedded in that, is a signal that the relationship between the two governments is something that is valued and is necessary from a South Korean national security perspective.
Okay. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for very enlightening discussions. By the way, I'm a teacher from Womenomics in Pennsylvania. Question for the defendants, especially for Nomura side, since we focused on the December agreement. I just wonder, do you really think it's a big deal? I think it was mentioned that it's really the agreement was reached under U.S. pressure. So do you think it's really change your mind on both sides, especially for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe? I mean, I can imagine, given the history, some Japanese officials will very soon, will say something stupid. Forgive my bluntness. Something about the company issues. And then when that happens, of course, you will have a new wave of anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korea. And any limited goodwill generated from the agreement will be disappearing. So I just want to know how much of a deal do you think it really is? I don't. I mean, probably even a 3-year-old child will not think too much about it. But I also have another question for Glosserman, because you mentioned that maybe Japan and South Korea should develop a common identity, about history. I mean, yes, you can have a lot to say about that, given that both countries are democracy, they have shared values, But on the other hand, both are heavily dependent on China economically. So, what kind of a common identity can they develop vis-a-vis China?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your question. First of all, yes. As I shown, the on the issue of the common agreement, there are 2 points. So on the adjustment of the interpretation of the treaties, which is the basis of the diplomatic relationship between Japan and South Korea, it was big. Because it was a very big problem between Japan and South Korea, because that, now, not only the government itself, but the judicial court also, intervene in the situation. And, as long as the Supreme Courts of two countries had a different interpretation of the treaties, it is very hard for us to have negotiations. So if the agreement is the starting point to adjust interpretation, it is very big things on the diplomatic negotiations. But as you said, on the public opinions, at this moment, it is never big things. But I can say it can be a starting point of the big changes. Because we can start not just about the common issue, but about the forced labors or other issues. Because the basic problem was the different interpretation of the treaty. So, but if we could adjust the interpretation, we can start many issues all together having the same interpretation or legal basis. So I said, if we can start something and a sincere effort to solve the problems, it can be the big things. So just a starting point. And yes, and one comment to your comment. And yes, also, I said that the agreement is, at this moment, it's just a product of the pressures from the United States, and it is a product of the diplomatic concerns. It's not a product of the concerning about the victims or try to solve the problem itself. But again, it can be the starting point. And also, now, again, I want to say that last December or now, we are having the very rare chances that we are having the very stable governments in two countries. Imagine the situation some years ago. Our governments are very unstable, both governments. Okay, both governments very unstable, and so we could not negotiate anything, and we couldn't do anything against the pressure of the public opinion. So I think the negotiation, the agreement, what or is can be or something, in even for the solution of the historical issues.
I think the agreement is a very big deal, and it should be made out as a big deal because it is a foundation. It could be lost. I mean, the fact that it has some fragility to it is not in doubt. But it's a big deal because there are other conditions that didn't exist in the 1990s that could create the basis for building on it very strongly. And I wouldn't say it's about, joint antagonism towards China. I'd put it differently. It's about joint efforts to build an international community with an Asian priority for these two countries. And the shortage of internationalist thinking in Japan has complicated this a lot. There's been quite a bit written lately in Japan, with Hosoya taking the lead, about the need to overcome the lack of internationalism on both the left and the right in Japan. And that as a cause of the wars leading to 1945 and as a cause now of inability to focus on what needs to be done. And I think even though the U.S. had this special role here, I think the U.S. was really playing the handmaiden for the larger cause of internationalism. And depending on what happens in the U.S., it may be that Japan and South Korea have to gang up together on the U.S. because if we fail on TPP and economic regionalism, we have a more isolationist approach, then they have to work together because they want us present in the region, and that might be what's needed to more failure in the United States to get them working closer together. But hopefully it's more energetic support from the U.S. that'll make it possible. But I think they both have to realize how important it is because there are not many more chances. This may be the last chance before big changes in the region. This region is taking shape very quickly in important ways, moving towards new architecture. And if these two countries are not working together, it is a huge problem.
Now, I'll add a footnote to that, and then we'll take a couple of questions. Time's going to run out a bit. When I was in Seoul from 2009 to 12, there was an increasing sense of urgency about the comfort women issue, simply because the comfort women victims are aging and the numbers dwindling. So it's very important to have a resolution of some sort of the issue while they were still alive. If you couldn't have resolved it until afterwards, it would have been very different qualitatively. So it needed to be done. It was an important issue. Okay, let me take several questions. Okay, yes, sir.
Okay, Wu is from the Center of the China Globalization. In terms of for the Jinnah University London. So my question is for Brad is from all the panelists just described the relationship between Korea and Japan. And the question was that what about the tendency about the U.S. policy to the Asia? Because I think it's not so clear right now. Okay. The question is that U.S. and Japan was allies. So okay, these allies for what? To solve what kind of question about Asia problem? Okay, let's go. Korea's problem should be solved by the China and the U.S. Maybe South Korea help it, but Japan plays no roles. So how to solve it? We just say collapse of the North Korea's country. I just say okay, it's maybe it's collapse of not North Korea, it's collapse of the Kim Jong-un. Because of North Korea, recent time crazy only, not all the country, crazy only one man is Kim Jong-un's. Because of my classmates, 20 years we studied in Moscow, he served for the Kim Jong-un. He told me only 1 minute or 2 minutes ago, our leader were very crazy. Yeah, because of first time he become the leader, he want to open map. He just say something. But a lot of officials think about this is a young man, we can take over very easily. So killing become after 1 year killing the officials. Okay, so that's the result. We see that. So negotiation, Korea problem is U.S. and China. Okay, and the Chicago problem is already no conclusion already. Counterpart between the Japan and China is no solution right now, and also U.S. cannot give the suggestion to Senkaku Island. Okay, this Diaoyu Island. South China Sea was only ASEAN, Vietnam, Philippines, and China, and the U.S. But no rules about Japan. If Japan wants to join, it's more complex. So I just say, okay, what about U.S. foreign policy for what? And his tendency for what? So U.S. and the Japan allies for what? It seems like useless.
Okay, I see
No
the
solving problem.
I see the question. Okay, on this side, please. Yes, sir.
I'm Ian from Glosserman University. My question is that can there be some mechanism for something like conflictual socialization, similar to like strategic and economic dialogue between U.S. and China, or like Japan and China? I mean, that mechanism actually works to manage both conflict and cooperation. And given that Japan is kind of broadly in the same track with America following China, so I was wondering whether there can be kind of similar.
Japan, China, not Japan are okay.
Yeah, Japan, China. So yeah.
Okay. Right, thank you. Yes, sir.
My observation is that really I felt very saddened given what we're talking about, community building, internationalism. Words such as reconciliation, morality, justice have not yet been uttered. It's astounding, it really saddens me greatly. And of course, and this deal, whatever, given its merits and demerits, it's at the heart. It's undemocratic, it's elitist, and it's doomed to fail. And I think this is my observation. And I believe South Korea got the worst. I don't know. It got really screwed up in the sense that the Japanese are ever since this deal are going to use this deal against them as a gag order. Don't ever talk about it. I mean, it's so clear.
Okay, thank you. And one last one here. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Great panel, great books. We've had a discussion mostly about contemporary policy, so I just want to kind of put more of a scholarly twist on it about terminology. I wonder, the panel title is about the values gap, but nobody, if I heard talk about values, we don't talk about national identity, and I just wonder, is that a dimension that I just didn't pick up on? Is there a sense from the panels that there's a values gap between the two countries? And similarly, just sort of following up on Dr. Ju's point, I mean, put more simply, is there a deal? The media talks about a deal and the panel talks about a deal, but it doesn't seem to me like there is a deal. Like there's a proposal for a deal. Like in the same way that there was a proposal for Japan and China to share gas resources, in the East China Sea, but like it was to say, let's have a deal, but there was no final language. And so I don't understand why we're talking about a deal if nothing's happened yet as far as I can tell.
Okay, so let's satisfy all those questions in the next 4 minutes, please. So, who'd like to start?
Go, Scott, go.
Well, I mean, I do think that there was a deal between the governments, and the question is whether it's going to be supported by the people. And that really is the crux of it. And yes, there's a lot of moral hazard related to this, and as I suggested, it is you could make an argument that it was a triumph of pragmatism over principle in this case, which is something quite ironic given Park Geun-hye's emphasis on principle.
You want to say?
Please go ahead.
You may. Let me offer a specific response to the questions and then a couple of general ones. Actually, yeah, the role for Japan. Japan's role is that it's the third largest economy of the world. It is a supporter of democracy, human dignity, open trade, free trading systems. A whole list of values. Its role is then in working with the United States and with like-minded countries, with South Korea, hopefully, Australia, Philippines, Vietnam, China in some cases, to create an international order that supports norms and principles such as the peaceful resolution of disputes that permit security, stability, and prosperity for everyone. That's Japan's role. That's a pretty good role to have. I mean, that's what a security order is all about. So I think you're asking about the nature of the contributions that Japan could make. And I think it can make a lot. Diplomatic resources, economic resources, cultural, know-how, business, you go through it. Can Japan offer military solutions in some cases? I think in an HADR context, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, maybe. I also would, by the way, would take issue, it's up to the United States and China to solve the Korean Peninsula problem? No. It's up to South Korea, if nothing else, and North Korea to solve that problem. It's their peninsula. And I think we have to be very careful about how we assume that. Now, in regards to the unbelievably negative negativity surrounding this deal, I would note, number one, there actually has been actions taken. The Abe administration, somebody tried to blow it up already, and the Abe administration made them sit down and sit in the corner and apologize for what they said. It's a zero tolerance, principle in the cabinet, and it's working. So, I mean, there are principles that are guiding.
How long is that going to last?
I suppose as long as people are suspicious and look for that and are always trying to undermine the agreement, not very long. But you've got indications of sincerity. So the question really, to go back to, I think, one notion. I would say, first of all, I think we did talk about reconciliation. Justice we didn't talk about, and that's probably an interesting question. I do think there was a degree of strategic calculation on the part of the South Koreans in forging this deal. I think Park Geun-hye felt backed into a corner. She had bet on certain foreign policy principles, dealing with China, dealing with North Korea, and she found that she had been wrong. And that she had not found the partner in Beijing, nor in Pyongyang that she expected, that her strategic leverage was diminished, and therefore she cut the best deal she could. That doesn't make it a bad deal, just makes it not perhaps the best deal. So then the question and the ultimate resolution of all this boils down to something that Scott and I point out and, emphasize in our book. I mentioned we wrote a book, by our book. And that is what is demanded is leadership. And the question is, will Pak and Abe prefer to be okay, maybe great in some contexts, in some circles, domestic leaders? Or will they aim for grand historical characters, to people that rewrite national narratives and rewrite the arc of history in their particular region? They have that opportunity if they lead. And that means mending their society's wills, recreating the sense of identity that they have, and forging the common identity that Gil talks about. Now, that is a choice that they can make, and it will require work on their part. But it is doable. It will not be easy. And it certainly isn't easy when everybody thinks that this is a deal in name only, and they're all waiting for it to collapse.
What was the deal that South Korea made with Japan established formal diplomatic relations? That was supposed to solve all the problems.
In 1965, it wasn't supposed to solve all the problems. It was another deal when the Vietnam War was going on, where the United States really needed that deal and got the two sides, after 15 years of fruitless negotiation, to come to an agreement. But it took 15 or 20 years before the leaders actually met with each other. So it didn't solve the problems, and nobody expected it to in 1965. I was around. I remember that. We were very happy there was a deal. Now, I think this is a very important deal, and I think Japan gave three things to South Korea that it really wanted. It got government money. It said before there was no government money. So that's all. It got as much money as it could have reasonably expected. Good money. It got a public apology from Abe and a telephone call from Abe to Park saying, we did wrong, and it got the military took responsibility. The military was blamed by the Japanese government, and that's what South Korea wanted. South Korea also wanted legal responsibility. Not a chance. That opens up everything for Japan. That says 1965 was not a real deal. It's an impossibility. If South Korea wants that, it's dealing with a new world. It can't ask for that. It's got to be pragmatic and say, let's see if we can find common ground. And as far as the comfort women being closed out of it, they weren't going to agree. These NGOs were never going to agree to this. I'm sure they should have been consulted. I don't know the degree of it, but they never would have been going to. It means the deal would have failed. So in other words, we got everything necessary for the deal to go forward, and now it's a question of building on it rather than saying it wasn't good enough and then starting over, and there is no way to start over.
Okay. Yeah.
So why Asian country cannot
Please.
recognize if so?
Yeah. Very quickly. Yeah, please. Yeah, just about the values. I don't know how I can define the values. But one of the very important point here is that now in Japan and South Korea, we have this kind of discourse. Like, we cannot talk to each other anymore because we have a different value and cultures. This is a very typical discourse in Japanese society. So I believe the deal is important. We have to show still we can make a deal. How we may different, but the value gap is not too big. Hold us not to be able to have any negotiation. So in that meaning that I'm wondering what we are talking about value gap. It's kind of illusions, I think. Of course, we are different, but I don't know how we can define the value. So in that meaning, the deals and the values are related to each other. That's my comment.
That was a very positive note to end on. Thank you very much. It was so good we couldn't even finish in time, an hour and 45 minutes. We were happy to do this for you. Let me ask in exchange you please fill out the evaluation forms you found in your chairs and leave with us before you leave. And let's also thank the panelists with a traditional round of applause.